Alright, so today we're continuing on with the second week of our sermon series that we're going through the Sermon on the Mount. If you weren't here last week, what we started a sermon series where we're going to be going through Matthew chapter 5 to 7. And the reason we're doing this in this specific section is because this is one of the fundamental places in the New Testament where Jesus sits down and just explains to everybody, this is what it takes to be a follower of me. So as followers of Christ, we're looking into specifically 5 through 7 because we want to know what it truly takes to be a follower of Him. So last week what we did is we talked about the Beatitudes, and we talked about the building of a personal relationship with Him. We talked about it starts with that. It starts with the personal relationship, and it gets deeper and deeper, and then it turns into acting like Jesus. Once you have that relationship with Jesus, you start to do the things that Jesus did. And then finally, we talked about it's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job for the rest of your life. So it's always about digging deeper into that personal relationship with Him. And the more you do that, the more you become like Him. So what we're doing today is we're skimming down a little bit, and we're going to be talking about verses 17 to 48. Now this is a big section of chapter 5. It's pretty much half of it. It's the second part of it, and we're going to be talking about verses 17 to 48. And we're not skimming over it. We're not skipping over the things in it. But it is true, we could take a week on about each of these things. But for the sake of time, I wanted to keep it under a 52-week series. So I'm skimming 17 to 48, and we're going to get the bigger picture. We're not missing the point, but sometimes we get so focused in on looking at specific verses that we miss the big picture that Jesus is talking about. So for the sake of the big picture, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at the big picture, and what Jesus is talking about in this big picture is relationships. Relationships between friends, family, spouse, husband and wife, really all types of relationships. But he's giving some advice on how to create good relationships, how to create proper relationships. So if you guys want to flip to Matthew 5, verse 17, we're going to start with this first section here. So in verse 17, going through 20, it says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law, until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." So it seems kind of weird that Jesus breaks up talking about what it takes to be a follower of me, and laying out all these things that he does in the New Testament. He takes time to talk about the importance of the Old Testament. And what he means here by the law is he means the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you've ever tried to read the Bible, maybe New Year's, it came around and you said, I'm going to read the Bible all the way through this year. Well, you get through Genesis, and it's a pretty easy read. You get through Exodus, it's one big storyline. But then you get to Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and you just slow down. It seems so boring because it's just command after command, rule after rule, law after law. And for us as Christians in the New Testament era, sometimes we can neglect talking about this stuff. And for a pretty good reason, Jesus says he's the fulfillment of the law. But he also says he did not come to abolish the law. You see, for us, although it's really hard to get through some of those books of the law, for the Jews of this time, that was like bread and butter. I mean, they would read it in the morning, in the afternoon, at night. This was the best story they ever heard. Because for them, it was God talking to them. It was the only rules or the law that they had, that God had given them. So God told them, do these things. And this is what it takes to be a godly person. But the Jews, over time, had kind of turned it in the wrong way. In verse 20, it talks about your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers of the law. And at first this sounds difficult because, we talked about they read it every day, but we were talking in Bible school this morning. Although they knew the law and they knew the rules that God had put in place, oftentimes they forgot what the whole point of the law was about. You see, they were so obsessed with not breaking the law that they would do everything they could to avoid that thing. But they would come up to the edge of it. See, God said, He gave them a guideline. He said, this is what it takes to be a godly person. Anything beyond that, you're not considered godly. But what would happen is they would neglect the reason why God set these guidelines, and they would walk on the perimeter. They would do everything they could except go that one extra inch. And we'll see as we continue on throughout this message that Jesus gives us what exactly that means, but that's what Jesus talks about. He sets up this idea of the Old Testament being important. That's why we still have it today. That's why we still have Genesis through Malachi in our Bibles. It's not that it's less important, but it's important because that's the reason we know Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. We have the Old Testament for proof so that we can show who Jesus is. But Jesus says it doesn't just take that to be a follower of me. It doesn't just take knowing the law, but it takes surpassing that knowledge and actually understanding what the law is about and doing that. So he starts to explain, and this is what the rest of the chapter is about, him explaining. He does it in this section called antithesis. And this word antithesis it's set up for the rest of the chapter in statements that says, you have heard it said blank, and he puts in an Old Testament commandment or something from the Old Testament. And then he says, but I tell you blank. And he would fill in the blank with his interpretation. So we see this a few times here in the rest of this verse, and it's all for a reason. But the first thing he talks about is murder. And he starts out and he says, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subjected to judgment. Now, if I were to ask you, what does it take to follow the commandment, do not murder? It'd be a pretty resounding answer. The simple answer is do not murder. It's pretty simple. Don't do something. How do you follow that? Well, by not doing it. All of us would understand you don't murder someone to follow that law. But what does Jesus say? He says, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subjected to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Rakah, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So, what would happen in these days is they followed the commandment, do not murder. They wouldn't murder people. But what they would do is they would beat somebody to within an inch of their life. But they thought, well, as long as I left them alive, as long as I left them within that inch of their life, then I'm fine. I didn't break the commandment. But Jesus says it starts way before that. It starts way before getting to that point. And like we said, the big theme is about relationships. And the first thing he talks about is this anger. He doesn't talk about murder. He talks about anger. And the first thing he says is that I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subjected to judgment. Now, the anger he means here is when you're talking with someone or something happens and you get upset and you might say something or you might think something, and a couple minutes later you come back and you apologize. You say, oh, I'm sorry. I got angry. I got upset. I didn't mean it. This is the kind of anger he's talking about. And he says that is subjected to judgment. You shouldn't be angry, but if you apologize, if you say I'm sorry, you own up to it, then that's the end. But if it progresses, if it musters inside of you, if it builds up, then it turns into purposefully hurting people. And this is where we see the term rakah. And for some reason, they didn't translate this word. They kept it the same. But what it roughly translates to is empty head. It'd be like calling someone an idiot. Like saying, oh, you don't know anything. You're dumb. So this is more of a thought out thing. It's not reactionary. See, Jesus is saying, if your reactionary anger builds up and you don't apologize, then it turns into this anger that you have for someone. And this is where we see the term rakah come up, where he's saying, you've thought about it and you're purposefully trying to be angry, trying to be mad at this person. But then it says, but anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read this, it's kind of scary because I know in my life, I've called people fools. I've said people are foolish. And when you first read this, it's kind of scary because you don't want to be thrown into the fire of hell because of that comment. But what Jesus is saying here is, it's not just you fool as we know it today. When he said you fool, he was basically calling someone a practical atheist. Someone who by their life, the way that they lived, you couldn't tell that they were godly. And even went beyond that. When they would say you fool, they would proclaim that they're not even worthy of God's grace. They're so bad that they don't even deserve the grace of God. And with that interpretation, you can kind of understand why it's so crazy of a punishment, the fire of hell. Because you're taking the place of God and giving someone their punishment, saying that God, you do not deserve God's grace. But what Jesus is saying here is that if you don't cut down that anger, if you just let that anger build up inside of you, then it turns into worse and worse things. And I think all of us, we've had a time where we've been mad at someone, or we've been mad at a situation, but we haven't done anything about it. And sometimes not doing anything about it makes it build up even more, and you start getting more mad and madder and madder, and eventually you get to a place where you just are completely mad at a person or a situation for something that could have been even so small when it first happened. You could have had a reactionary anger, but if you let it build up, it becomes this anger. And what the relationship thing here Jesus is saying is, he's saying, do not let anger ruin relationships. If you go on, he brings up two situations. He says, if you're getting ready to go to the altar and sacrifice, but realize basically you and your brother are fighting, or you're angry with your brother, and your brother's a loose term here, anybody that you have a relationship with, he says, just stop and go deal with that first. He says, deal with that relationship first, and then come to me, offer it. And then he goes on to say, if your adversary is taking you to court, settle it out of court. And then he says, if you don't, then the righteousness due to you will happen. But what he's saying, he's saying, don't let anger ruin the relationship you have. Don't just let something little completely ruin a perfectly good relationship. And this goes for all types of relationships. But that's what Jesus is saying. He says it's not just about murder, but it's about preventing that anger from ever starting. It's about apologizing. It's about forgiving. It's about going to that person and settling that argument. Well, he goes from the commandment of murder, and he seems like he completely jumped ship to two very hot topics for today: adultery and divorce. You see, it looks like it has nothing connecting it, but we know that this whole thing is about relationships. So we're going to read a little bit from section 21 through 32, and we're just going to read a couple of verses out of it. But it says, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And if you skip down to 31, it says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress. and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, once again, these are two passages that we could spend a whole week talking about. But for the big picture, Jesus is saying two similar things in these two statements. Now, it's important for us to hear the context. We can't literally hear the context, but it's important for us to know the context. And unfortunately, the context was not very good for women in this day. Men were the leaders. They were the Pharisees and the scribes. So they were in the position to interpret the law that we were talking about. But because of that, they often interpreted the law for men to get away with whatever they wanted to. You might be familiar with the story in John where the leaders, they catch a woman in the act of adultery. In the act of adultery. And they lay her down, and Jesus basically says, "He who without sin be the first to cast, or be the one to cast the first stone." And what Jesus is saying here is that everyone's sinful, but the man never comes up in that story. And that just shows the context that people had. Men could pretty much get away with anything they wanted. It was pretty much impossible for a man to be condemned for adultery. But all it really took for a woman was a man saying, "Oh yeah, she committed adultery." Women couldn't testify, so it was basically whatever you wanted to say. And just like that, divorce had become a very male-centered thing. A man could pretty much get a divorce for anything he wanted. They talk about it in the first century, the leaders, about what all the things that men can get a divorce for. Some of the things that they mention is that, well, she just doesn't look as good as she used to. Or, the guy was walking home one night and he saw a prettier looking woman that he wanted. They would say, "Oh, well, of course that's grounds for divorce." They would say, "Well, she couldn't have kids." Or maybe she could have kids, but he just didn't like her kids. Or he didn't like the way she treated the kids. All grounds for divorce, because of course. But then there's also one story, and the Pharisees or the leaders had given this man the certificate for, catch this, what his wife did was she simply burned dinner one night. That's it. Burning dinner was enough for a man to get a certificate of divorce. And although it's pretty crazy to think of, because, we've all burned dinner once or twice in our lives, but it just shows the relationship that a lot of these men had with their wives. And it simply was just a shallow relationship. It was a very selfish relationship. So Jesus isn't trying to say, he's not trying to set up this new legalism like the Jews would follow, but he's trying to set up the reason for marriage. He says marriage isn't part of just, jumping into it because for selfish reasons, what can I get out of marriage? But jumping into marriage is about what you can do for the other person. But you see, in today's society where 50% of marriages end in divorce, we're still pretty much facing this idea of why we're getting married. Jesus tries to explain that it's not for selfish reasons that we get married, but it's to leave our family and be united as one. It's about giving everything you have to the other person. And if you talk to a couple who's been together for a long time, they won't tell you that they've never had a fight or they've never had an argument or there's never been a tough time. But they'll tell you that they worked through it. And that's what Jesus is trying to say here. He's saying just don't throw it away because the wife burned the dinner. He's saying have a true relationship. But the one thing he talks about the relationship ending is by adultery. And that's why I connected the verse before. Because he's kind of building on divorce with this idea of adultery. And the two things that cause people to break these rules or these commandments are selfishness. You see, if you're in a relationship or you're in a marriage and you're just in it for what you can get out of it, well, when things start going rough at home, it's easier for you to turn away and go find someone else. Whether you're still married or whether you get divorced and go find someone else. If all it is about you, then there's no reason not to just throw it all away. But Jesus is trying to say, don't let selfishness ruin relationships. Don't let your pride or your self-centeredness throw away a relationship that God has set up for you. But we all know those families who we don't even like to talk about it out loud, that their situations were so bad at home that they got a split, and once the divorce happened, the man or the woman took the kids and ran off. And Jesus isn't saying you should put up with abuse and neglect and all these things because this is the new legalism law. He's saying that it should be about what you can do for your spouse. So don't twist Jesus' words here and say that, if you get a divorce, it's the unforgivable sin. But Jesus is trying to say, get married in the first place for the right reason. And he's saying, don't let selfish desires ruin that relationship. So it goes from adultery, and once again, it seems like you jump ship to an idea about oaths, or about keeping your word. So let's continue on, and we'll read that section. It says, again you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. You do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Anything beyond that is from the evil one. So when we go from talking about very hot topics in today's society, adultery and divorce, to talking about something that we pretty much don't do. See, oaths were set up in the Old Testament for people to have each other's word. They would say, well, I'll trade for you for the next 5 years and no one else. And they'll swear by heaven, or they'll swear by God, or they'll swear by their own head. And what they were saying is, if I break my promise, then I'm accepting the due penalty. God to cast me down, or you to kill me, I'm accepting that. But today, that's not necessarily what we do. If we promise we're going to do business with someone, the only thing we really have is our word. If someone comes up to you and says, I want to do business with you in your company. Well, you have no proof that they could just be lying. All you have is the word that they're saying. And Jesus is saying, don't let doubt ruin relationships. You see, we all know those people who their yes really never means yes, and their no never really means no. You can't trust them with anything. And sometimes that can be us to a certain extent, but Jesus is saying, be so strong in your actions. Let your words not pander on. Don't try to convince someone. But just have a good enough relationship where if you say yes or you say no, the other person understands it and understands exactly what you're talking about. Oftentimes we get so caught up in trying to convince people that our yes means yes or that our no means no, and the relationship gets ruined because there's so much doubt there. But Jesus is saying, he's saying, have integrity. Don't lie. Don't go on. Don't try to weasel your way out of things. If you say yes, go with it. And if you say no, mean no. But then he goes on to the next section, an eye for an eye. Now, I don't know about you, but it seems like all of these are just about completely different things. And you're right to a certain extent. They're all about Old Testament commandments. But we'll see that this one kind of ties everything together here. It says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, what Jesus is saying here is he's saying that it's not about getting back at someone. This idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth was foundational for societies to start. See, without this commandment, there was no law that dictated the punishment for people. If I were to come and punch you and your tooth were to fall out, There's nothing stopping you and your family from coming back and killing. Although I think that would be an escalation, there's truly nothing stopping you from coming and killing. And then, there's nothing stopping my family from coming back and killing 2 of you guys. And the process goes on and on and on, and it leads to unnecessary bloodshed. But if this is the rule, if I come and knock your tooth out, the most you can do is come knock my tooth out. Although that sounds barbaric, that's the only way they kept society sustainable. But Jesus says that's not really what being a follower of him is all about. He says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute. Once again, he brings up this persecution idea that we talked about last week, and it's difficult. Doing things that others, take advantage of you for, it's hard to keep doing that. But Jesus says it's all about that relationship. And he says, don't let revenge ruin that relationship. Someone wrongs you, and the first thing you want to do is get back at them and show them how hurt you are. If someone hurts you, you just want to make sure that they know. You're fine, you're moving on, but you just do that a little bit more so they know how much they hurt you. But Jesus says that's not the case. And this is what he's saying in a lot of these things that we talked about. Don't let revenge or don't let this anger consume you so that you can't forgive. But how? What is possible to connect all this together? What makes all of these things possible? Why are we even talking about these things? Why should we not let anger ruin relationships? Why should we not let selfishness ruin relationships? If there's nothing there to keep it all together, then all of these don't really have a point. But there's one thing that makes all of these things worth it, and it's love. See, love's the only thing that keeps everything together. No, without love, there's no reason not to be angry. But because you love that person, you don't want anger to consume that relationship. Because you love your spouse, because you love your husband or your wife, you don't want to commit adultery or get divorced because you love them and you want to do everything you can for them. Because you love the relationships you have with people, you want your word, and you don't want revenge to ruin the relationship. But without love, it all falls apart because there's no reason for it. Love your neighbor and love your enemy. Don't hate your enemy. See, oftentimes we want to hate those who go against us, but love is the only thing that keeps everything together. If you've turned on the news in the past couple of days, or you've been on Facebook or Twitter, you've seen all the things that have happened, all the shootings on both sides, and cops getting shot and cops shooting other people. And it's really easy to want to respond in a couple of these different ways. You want to respond with revenge. You want to respond with anger. But Jesus is saying that's not what it takes to be a follower of me. If you want to follow me, you have to respond that with love. But responding with love doesn't always get the headlines. You don't always see that on the nightly news. You often see the revenge or the anger build up in people. You often see the chasms that come from this. But Jesus says, if you want to be a follower of me, love is what you have to go for. Love is how you have to respond to everything, because when everything seems like it's falling apart, when everything seems like it's disconnected, all the things are going wrong, and every day it seems like things are just going horribly, love is the only thing that keeps everything together. Without love, there's nothing. Without the love we have in our relationships, there's no point in trying to keep a godly relationship. But Jesus ends this section. He says, be perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, this statement isn't one of those where you should try to be like God, because we're never going to get there. But God loved us so much that he gave his one and only Son, that for whoever believes in him should have eternal life because of his death on the cross. Because he loved us so much, He took everything, all the brokenness, all the things that seemed like it was falling apart in the world, and he connected them. And he holds everything together today because of the love he has for us. He loves us enough to forgive us of our sins. He loves us enough not to divorce us and let us die. He loves us to keep his word. When he says, your sins are forgiven, he means your sins are truly forgiven. And when we mess up, and God knows we mess up every day, he doesn't take back his word. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't look for revenge. He just simply loves us. So what I want you guys to do this week, the relationships you have, your family, your friends, all the relationships you have, evaluate it. Are you truly loving someone? Or are you so consumed with anger or revenge or selfishness that you just neglect actually helping that relationship, actually pursuing a godly relationship with that person? Well, this week, find out. Find out what the relationships you have in your life look like. I don't know what it's going to take for you, whether you need to write it down or you just mentally do it. But within your work, when you get home, the relationship you have with your friends, see what it's like. And see if it measures up to what it takes to be a Christ follower. And remember, when all things seem lost, when all things seem like they're falling apart and nothing is working out, love. Love's the only thing that keeps everything together. So we're going to have a song of invitation. Number 315 in the hymn books. And John is going to sing it, Courtney's going to play the piano. And if you don't know that loving relationship that God has with you, that Jesus has with you, then I encourage you, take this time. You can come up here and talk to me. We'll just meditate on this idea of love. And just figure out what it means in your life. Figure out what it is going to take for you to have that loving relationship with your friends, your family, your coworkers. And if you don't know that loving relationship with Christ, this is the time in which we offer up the time to come forward and talk about baptism. So if that's what you want to do today, as we sing this song, I encourage you to come up here.